Numbers and a lot of anecdotal reports comment on how much crime increases. So on the sort of corporate side of things, it's very, very common for these attacks to ramp up. I mean, essentially cyber criminals are looking for absolutely any opportunity they can to make money, to find new ways of exploiting systems and ultimately people. I have a lot of interfacing with the law enforcement community. There's some big issues there as well, with crime going up in a number of different areas, actually, especially if you think of people not earning as much money, and certain sections of the community have issues with drugs, more people at home, domestic violence. It's a real problem, and I know that my police colleagues are busier now than they were before this incident, and also my corporate sector colleagues, keeping networks safe, people working from home, you know, more surface area for networks to be breached. So it is definitely a big problem.
Now, a number of people that are signing today may not be familiar with Magnet Forensic, because I believe that in the past, Magnet Forensic primarily are used by government, law enforcement agency, intelligence agency, really to just go after cyber criminal. But the tool itself, I believe in the last 3 years or so, a number of banks, larger corporations, they can basically start to deploy and doing their own cyber investigation. Is that right?
Yeah, so sort of our main product is called AXIOM, and our real advantage to using our software is we have what we call the artifact first approach. So when you want to analyze a computer hard drive, a phone, or even now more commonly cloud sources, we have the approach where we essentially process the information and present to you what it is that you need to see first up. So rather than looking through a file system and all these particular files, we can give you just a very concise and quick view of the data. And it makes it much easier to conduct investigations if you are an expert. And it also makes it much easier if you're kind of on the learning curve, or you're not super technical. You're still able to look at data and actually understand what it is that you're seeing that's in front of you. And more we have a lot of customers coming on board from the corporate sector, simply because it's just such a streamlined approach to doing analysis of electronic evidence.
Okay, so in particularly the company named Magnet, for example, a lot of people thinking that, oh, is this a CSI type of thing that I need to do, etc. It sounds interesting, but at the same time, do I have the technical skill? Well, I believe that your session is about to tell people what Mac operating system forensic artifact technique that is essential for investigation.
Yeah, so Macs are very interesting and distinct from what we sort of generally consider a PC, a laptop like I'm on here now with Windows, because Apple as a company own the hardware and they own the software. And for a long time, we've had issues with Apple iPhones being able to get data off of them. And with Mac hardware, it's exactly the same now. So this is a slightly more technical talk. Given our time frame here, it's a bit of an abridged version. But it sort of just talk through some of the challenges, but some of the data that you're able to get when you're doing analysis of a Mac platform as well.
Okay, well, go ahead and start your presentations. And I think everybody's eager to wait to listen to you.
All right. So as mentioned, this is an abridged version of a presentation we've done before for this format, and I guess we just want to give an overview of some of the challenges you'll face with doing analysis of Mac hardware. Very happy if you want to reach out to me for the slides or to ask any more questions at the end. So we've already done me, so I'll move on and I'll dive straight into it. So there's two parts to this. Obviously, there's the data that you finally want to look at, but before we can get to that point, you need to understand a little bit about the hardware and software that you'll encounter. And so the primary file system on modern Macs now is APFS, but you'll also have some issues with the actual hardware as well. So just taking a look at APFS.
Someone actually asking, are you able to maximize your screen? Because they have a hard time looking at your screen.
Oh, okay. There we go. Is that better?
No, actually, yeah, that's better. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so just a quick overview of APFS and why this is important to an investigator. For a long time, Apple used a file system called HFS Plus, a hierarchical file system, and that's now been superseded by this Apple file system. And it's, as a piece of technology, much more advanced and much more appropriate for current use. Importantly, it's tuned for SSD rather than spinning disk, and that has some implications for investigators, especially as they start to dig deeper. It has this property called copy on write, and again, this is part of the whole system of it being tuned for SSD. And essentially, what happens is different files from the file system can share blocks of data, clusters, if you will. Taken this term from Windows, and this can essentially make constructing a file system that much more complicated when any particular file can share blocks with an existing file and have some of its own as well. We also have this concept of a container layer or a pooled storage, and what that means is that partitions on the disk, or what you may think of as partitions, aren't of one fixed size. In fact, they can be no fixed size at all, and each of the partitions can share all of the unallocated space. So they can grow and shrink. You could have unallocated blocks that then get allocated to one particular pool, deallocated, and then allocated to a different pool. And again, the way that this data is shared around can make your life a little bit more difficult in reconstructing a file system, or make certain actions impossible. The other thing about APFS that's probably really, really important is that it has encryption built in, baked in by design, which makes the encryption that is part of the file system, much more robust than it was in the past. We have snapshot support. Again, this might be on the positive side, that we have the ability to find historical data or older versions of files that can be used to reconstruct a timeline. And the file system is able to support a lot more files, so 9 quintillion files. So that's 18 zeros. And as I mentioned, Apple controls all of their hardware, and so the whole idea of APFS is you're going to find this this file system on all of their devices, including iPhones. So just to recap on the time and the time stamps, in HFS there was a 1 second resolution, so you would never get 51842 point anything, but on APFS we have nanosecond time resolution now, so that's a lot more precision in time. Again, in effect, it may not provide much, but it's certainly a lot better than 1 second resolution. So your analysis is bound to get slightly more accurate. Okay, over to the hardware and the encryption. This is where it's probably the slightly more negative news that we have. If you're used to iPhones, which a lot of us are now, and the difficulty these present in both corporate investigations, but especially in law enforcement, an iPhone is very hard to get into without a cooperative owner or some extremely specialized hardware. And the reason is that there is hardware built in that prevents a lot of the ways that we have of typically getting around passwords and encryption. So much like on the iPhone, we have this thing called a secure enclave processor, and it is essentially the main security aspect, main security enforcement bureau of Apple land. And you can see in the bottom right hand corner, this is a diagram from Apple, but the important thing here is the box in the middle represents this Apple T2 chip. You can see the secure enclave processor in there, and on one side we have the NAND storage, so where all your data is stored, and on the other side you have the CPU, or the out portion, and you can see that all the data has to run through this this cryptographic land, this secure enclave processor. And so that means that everything on the NAND storage is encrypted no matter what. We have another layer of encryption, which is this file vault 2, which you may be used to. It's been around for quite a while. So we can actually have multiple levels of encryption here. Important thing to remember here is even if the file vault encryption is turned off, the data on the NAND storage is still encrypted as it travels through that secure enclave processor, that T2 chip. But what this allows, and really important to keep this in mind, is this effaceable storage, which essentially is a fancy way of saying it can be wiped really quickly. We don't have to wipe the disk, we just have to throw away the keys and the data is essentially lost forever. The T2 chip also implements secure boot and secure login. So these are, again, ways preventing analysts from accessing the data on the disk. And it also controls the Touch ID, much like the Touch ID on an iPhone or the Face ID. So the secure startup is controlled through the startup utility, and we also have another protection called SIP, or System Integrity Protection. Integrity protection is a way that the Mac prevents a user accessing essentially locations on the computer that would typically only be accessed by a root user. And there's some examples there, and such as pre-installed apps with OS X. And if you want to access these locations, you actually need to turn the system off. To do that, you need to boot into recovery mode. And again, there's some instructions there. But importantly, you need to have the ability to boot into recovery mode and restart the machine and use an administrator password. Same with the startup utility. If you want to run a tool such as Paladin, you need to be able to actually boot from a USB or a CD if you're going down that old methods. And to do that, you need to turn off the firmware protection that prevents it booting from other disks. So you can see in the example we've got here is full security turned on and disallowing access from USBs. So typically, if you want to use something like Paladin, you will need to turn that to no security and allow booting from external media to be able to get that hardware to boot from that disk. So that's a bit of an overview of the hardware and some of the challenge. That is a very abridged version that we're working here today. There's a lot of detail in all of this, but that's just sort of a quick overview of that. I want to talk about some of the artifacts that you'll encounter. So at this point, we're assuming that we've got a copy of the disk and we're ready to get into some analysis. Mac's actually really nice in terms of the artifacts that the operating system has. There's lots and lots of data, lots and lots of ways that you can piece together histories on the machine once you do get that data. I'm only going to talk about a few of those today from a very high level. So again, please touch base with me if you want to know any more detail. KnowledgeC. I've got one slide on KnowledgeC. And you can most definitely do a whole hour-long presentation on this database. There is an insane amount of information that's stored in KnowledgeC, and it really has a lot of fine-grained information about the previous activity of the system. It's an SQLite database, and you can see here in my list, there's just a couple of examples of some things that it tracks. So activities that the application is taking, application focus. So you're able to tell in quite fine-grained detail which applications have been on the screen. Device plugged in state, so whether the power was connected and when it was disconnected. Even something as simple as a screen backlight state. So you just imagine that you were doing a corporate investigation into somebody who maybe is actually not doing any work when they say they're doing a whole bunch of work. And we could tell that they started work at 9 a.m. The screen backlight on their Mac laptop went dark at 9:15 and didn't come back on until 4:45 p.m. And maybe that's some information, among others, that we could use to help sort of piece together the activity of that person and that computer. This database is also available on iOS if you have the ability to get a full file system extract, and it includes much more data, extremely valuable on a iOS device. And the locations of that database is listed there as well. Okay, FSEvents. If you're familiar with Windows analysis and the USN journal $J, this would be the closest kind of comparison we have between FSEvents and a Windows structure. It essentially is a list, a history of events, changes that have happened on the file system. Again, so it's a really nice way of piecing together, reconstructing previous events. It has file IDs, so you can get down to some fine-grained sequencing of those events. And we have some examples of ways that you could use it. I have some more examples coming up in a minute too. But for instance, here you could look at trying to find out what had been sent to the trash or the recycle bin if you come from Windows land. Simply by looking through this FSEvents, doing some filtering for renamed or .trash. This renamed flag, as you'll see down the bottom here in this blue highlighted part of the diagram, this indicates that a file has been moved on the same file system, flagged as what's called renamed. But you can also look for mount or volumes. So this is a really great way. This is the example I have here on the right. So under flags, you can see the mount, and under the file path, you can see volumes. This is a really nice way of seeing volumes that have been connected to the system in previous times. So you can see in this example here that there's lots of different volumes that have been connected. Keeping in mind that on Mac, you know, an installer is often a DMG file, and that will be mounted as a volume. So USB connections, this is one of the primary questions we get in regards to doing analysis in a corporate setting. How can I see which USBs have been connected, and how can I see what they have essentially copied onto that USB? Well, it's like anything, it's always a bit difficult and can be primarily built around inferences, but there's a couple of ways you can do it on a Mac. First is volume information, so looking in the plist, find a plist, and there's lots of information that's recorded in there about volumes that have been connected to the system. FSEvents, which I just spoke about, so you can look at these mount, unmount, and /volume keywords within that list. There's another log called daily.out log, and that has a lot of information about disk usage and networking in it, and also the unified log. I could dive into the unified log a lot more, but I won't because it's heavy on detail. But essentially, you can be looking for these strings here: USB, MSC, and a manufacturer of a drive. And you can see some examples here from the Apple Finder plist on the right there, and the daily.out log. Quarantine files are an amazing source of data that you can get on a Mac. Really, really nice system where essentially files that are downloaded from the internet or from other locations are essentially flagged as being in quarantine, and the user has to explicitly allow them to be opened before they can actually open them in another application. Quarantine-aware apps such as Safari, Messages, iChat, Mail, also Chrome and AirDrop, as you'll see in a minute. And when they're quarantined, you can essentially see the date and time and where that file originated from. So I'm going to circle back to AirDrop and quarantine in a minute. But I wanted to point out too that we're used to seeing in Windows lots of file metadata, such as a created, access, modified times, and so on. And you can see that on the left here for a Mac. But we also have these spotlight attributes and extended attributes that you can find with any given file on a Mac. And these are lovely, and they can really contain a lot of information that can help your investigation. So one here highlighted on the right is the KMD item where froms, and that will give you the location of where a file has been downloaded from. Down the bottom here in extended attributes, you can see a COM Apple quarantine. And if you look in there, you can see a GUID starting with 7.5, so on. That number, or that GUID, is essentially unique and identifies this in that quarantine database that we just talked about. So again, a way of tying these things together. AirDrop. AirDrop is a way of transferring files using Wi-Fi and Bluetooth between Apple hardware. So whether that's two iOS devices or an iOS and a Mac, one way or the other. And what you'll find is when a file is transferred via AirDrop on a Mac or to a Mac, it'll end up with a record in this quarantine files, which is nice. So in this list here, you can see the sharing D, and sharing D is a service that AirDrop uses for transferring files. It's also used for a few other things, so it's not 100%. It's most commonly used for AirDrop. So what I wanted to point out here is a couple of artifacts that we have in Axiom that have been essentially data paths from the file system. On the top left here, we've got quarantine files. And again, you can see this identifier that I spoke about before. the application, which is sharing D, a time that's associated with that, which is very nice. If you look over to the right, we've got the file metadata, and you can see in there a bunch of information about that. And right down the bottom there, ComApple quarantine, you can see that identifier in there starting with 09, which matches this quarantine files database just here. And in the bottom left is a different artifact, but it's essentially about artifact AirDrop incoming transfers. And so there's some information that we can see about an AirDrop. An AirDrop transaction essentially happened during that time. And again, we're stitching together different pieces of information to build a profile or a timeline of what happened. Speaking of timelines, this is the Axiom timeline viewer here, and I just selected some of those events just to put them into a different format to be able to kind of see them in a different way. This is very helpful when you're doing your analysis to be able to see data in a timeline format like this. And you can see here, sort of starting up the top of the timeline, we've got some network activity. This is to do with the AirDrop session being set up. And then you can see this quarantine files just here, and that's when the quarantine files entry has been inserted into that database. Again, some more AirDrop background activity, and then when you see the file knowledge there, that is the dates and times of the actual file system files that have been transferred over. So again, we can see them kind of hitting the file system and being saved to their final location. Right down into the very bottom, you'll see it's a few seconds later, but we have some quick look thumbnails that have been created. And again, this gives us kind of the complete picture of these files being transferred by AirDrop over to the file system and saved in a location. And that's just a nice way of seeing that whole transaction happen. One other artifact that I wanted to point out to you was the Spotlight shortcuts. This is Spotlight, if you're not familiar, is the essentially the search engine of the file system. So you can look for file names, you can look for file types, keywords within files. It's a very, very powerful search engine across the file system. And happily, it keeps a lot of information within its database that you can use, especially allowing you to see files that have been accessed and have been present on a file system at some point. Again, allowing you to reconstruct that history, what's happened, what files has this person looked at, what USBs have been connected, and then potentially, files that have been exfiltrated from an organization. There are many, many, many more artifacts that I would love to talk about. That is just a couple ones that I find interesting that I wanted to share in this format, but very happy to talk in more detail about any of this if you like. Yeah, please contact me if you've got any questions.
Great, thank you, Matthew. We do have a couple of questions coming in. You probably will see it. Let's just basically answer a high-rule question first. Nowadays, most of the data is stored in cloud platform. How do you ensure forensic analysis could be done for this kind of case?
So Axiom as a platform is, we're not a computer tool. We do computer, phone, and clouds. And cloud is something that's increasingly ramping up. And it wasn't so long ago that I think a lot of people thought, oh, cloud, it's not that important. But if I just give the example of something like Facebook Messenger, if you take a phone and you put it into flight mode and you extract the data from that and you find your Facebook Messenger messages, essentially you've only got, in most cases, 2 weeks of conversation history that actually resides on that phone, and the rest of it is stored in the cloud. So you've got a couple of options. You can work with what you've got, You can attempt the phone to force the phone to connect and download more messages, which is not exactly scientific. Or you could try to interface with the cloud service provider and get the data that way as a separate item and as a separate action. And that's essentially what we would advocate, is that you need to be collecting that cloud data as well. It's not always easy. Cloud services change all the time. Cloud service providers don't always like the fact that that tools such as ours and others out there are pulling directly from the interfaces. But yes, most certainly you need to be looking at what data's in the cloud as well. And this is another really big part of the picture. And as far as sort of Apple ecosystem goes, there is a lot of data that you can pull from the cloud.
Wow. Okay. All right. Is there any way to tie an AirDrop event to a phone? There have been some media around people about airdropping photo randomly, usually sexual nature. I'm not going to go there.
Yeah, no, this is a bit of a thing. That there's been a few articles around on this that presumably some kind of not very nice people just randomly picking an airdrop target and sending photos, usually of a sexual nature, but it could be anything. And there's actually surprisingly little evidence that's available after this, although there are some methods of if you have a phone of pulling some information. Of course, full file system extract helps actually finding the original file that was sent on a phone, but we can force a phone to sort of create a system log file called sysdiagnose, and it's a bit of there's a couple of steps to it. But so if anybody's interested, I'd be happy to share the information. But you're able to force a phone to create a log file, and ironically, the best way to get that off is to airdrop it to another computer. But yes, it's definitely possible, and there's definitely some actions that are logged when an iPhone sends a file via AirDrop.
Okay, great. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you, Matthew, Simon, for presentation today. And because of what the company does and that sort of thing, there's a lot of sensitive information that or question that people usually don't like to ask. Even at a live event, they will basically pull Matthew apart and say, or aside and say, "Oh, can we do this? Can we do that?" And that sort of thing. I've seen people does that before. If you basically have a lot of sensitive questions and you want to basically ask it together with your superior, your bosses, or your shareholder, your board, please feel free to reach out to Matthew or me because I take 5% commission cut.
Checks in the mail.
Yeah. Otherwise, you can see there's a lot of thank you notes there. Thank you again for speaking today. And again, we hope to see you in Kuala Lumpur or Singapore after this pandemic is being contained.
I can't wait till we get back to normal again.
Let's
look forward to seeing you all.
Thank you
so much.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye, Matthew.
Bye.